it's a hard thing to argue with because even when we look at, break it down because again, in the UK, you apply to a given program that we can break it down by program. Sure, if you're applying to philosophy, politics, and economics or medicine or something like that at Oxford or Cambridge, we're at the higher end of those single digits. But if you're applying to history, if you're applying to English, if you're applying to something like that, we're at 25% in a lot of cases. If you're looking at math or a language, those numbers even go higher.
Kevin Newton, how are you, my friend?
Doing great, Mark. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you for coming on YouTube, friends. Kevin Newton is the founder of An Education Abroad. He specializes in helping Americans go to college and university in other places other than the U.S., and he has been on our podcast for several years. He actually has his own podcast. And for my company, School Match for You, we use him as our international office for someone that wants to go overseas. So today we're gonna just tackle it and go for this question, like, why go overseas? Why does your phone ring, Kevin, when people say, I'm thinking about going to another country? What are the reasons you hear? You've been doing this for a while.
I think it's a lot of reasons, Mark. Certainly, let's not ignore the elephant in the room. As the political tides are shifting, some people are feeling a little bit of unease about it. And, that's not to say that political tides are not or are shifting overseas. Every country is different and history is cyclical. So it is something that kind of past life as a geopolitical consultant comes into play in a little bit of
There
this.
you go. And would you say you've seen a rise in that is a main articulated reason, under the current administration versus before? You've been doing this before, and any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And I think, to kind of piggyback off of that with some of the changes that have happened with student financial aid over the past couple of years is also the affordability factor. I mean, one of my favorite things to say, and, I say this as a William and Mary grad, it is cheaper for someone in state in Virginia to go to Oxford for their degree than it is to go to William and Mary. And that's including travel expenses. That's including room and board. That's including everything. Now, that's assuming you're not getting a lot of merit or need-based aid in Virginia. But if you're sitting in Fairfax County or in Alexandria, chances are you're not getting a lot of that aid.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Yeah, would you say that's something that's not very well known by most people in the public?
There's some misconceptions out there. People get caught up on things they see on Facebook.
Right.
About you can go to college for Germany or in Germany for free, or it's 500 euros. And, on the face of it, those are technically true. However, you have to speak German for most of those programs.
Right.
Or you need to be a citizen of an EU country. Where I think that people are really surprised is when we start talking about these elite institutions, that they are relatively affordable. I mean, I don't want to make light of them. They're still not cheap. Education is an investment. And I think
but if you're talking about cheaper than in-state Virginia,
right.
Virginia is an expensive state, but you're talking about under $50K potentially.
Right. Yeah. And it's also, Virginia can be quite competitive. It's not as competitive as its neighbor to the south. I've got a number of students from North Carolina who have said, if we were to get into UNC, that's where we're going. And these are even Duke fans saying that, because I think it speaks to how highly UNC is held. But
this is going to surprise you, Kevin. We have a lot of data. You know what was the hardest school last year to get in out of state?
What?
Public school? UVA. Yeah. UVA. I mean, UNC is right there with it. UCLA is right there in the conversation. Absolutely. I'd say those, from our data, those are the three hardest. There's like Texas, Berkeley, Michigan, all kind of very, very, very hard. And then Georgia Tech for sure. So those are the 7 that are the hardest schools to get into out of state.
Really not shocked by that. It's obviously the part of me that's still a little attached to William and Mary would like to see it join those ranks.
Yeah, is that a little bit of a knife in and twist that it's UVA?
Look, you know what? It's I have an immense amount of respect for the University of Virginia.
Right.
Still
a rival.
They just need to remember where their founder came from. And if there's a statue of Thomas Jefferson as a former student at William and Mary, not as the founder at UVA.
With the 1693 sign on it.
Look,
you guys pride yourself. Those of you who don't know, Kevin went to William and Mary, second oldest school in the country, only behind Harvard, founded in 1693. And get that right when you're talking about them.
It is one of those numbers that's burned into every. I think that the average William and Mary student's ATM PIN number is probably 1693. It
Their
just
password on to get into the
it just
log
it
in
had
onto their
burned into
phone.
your consciousness.
So
And
listen, you've already given us three reasons right away.
right.
You've already said the political climate. Go somewhere that's not as hostile to, progressive ideas, progressive values. You've also said affordability, and then you've said difficulty of admission. Like you can get into, a top tier school easier there than over here. And you and I have seen that. We've worked together and seen success for some students at some of the most elite schools in the world overseas that would not have had that same success over here if they would have stayed
Yeah.
here.
And I just want to kind of back that up with some numbers because despite being more of a history and languages person. My wife, who's an attorney, jokes that neither of us went to math school, but
Huh.
I feel that it's useful to kind of have the numbers in that instance. When we're talking about a place like Oxford,
Hmm.
we've got about a 17-18% acceptance rate. Now
Yep.
already, Mark, you would know Harvard or Stanford or, that place in Charlottesville's admissions statistics.
No, there are quite a few schools, especially in regular admission. It's a pretty significant. There's a pretty large number now that are single digits in regular admission.
No, and it really is, it's a hard thing to argue with because even when we look at, we can break it down because again, in the UK, you apply to a given program that we can break it down by program. Sure, if you're applying to philosophy, politics, and economics or medicine or something like that at Oxford or Cambridge, we're at the higher end of those single digits. But if
Sure.
you're applying to history, if you're applying to English, if you're applying to something like that, we're 25% in a lot of cases. And, if you're looking at math or a language, those numbers even go higher.
Yeah.
STEM also tends to be about 20-25%.
Hmm.
And these are the competitive places. LSE is in a league of its own because they're small, they're hyper competitive. So I do want to acknowledge that. But when we start looking at, other, as much as we don't like to lean into the rankings, but still global top 100, top 200 universities outside the US, we have acceptance rates above 50%.
You just brought a flashback back to a student I worked with that was very upset that it didn't look like he was going to be able to get into Georgetown. And he said, I'm going to St. Andrews because he felt like I can go, like status is really important. He felt like I can go to a school with some international status that it doesn't look like I'm going to be able to do over here.
And it's, we both in our practices make a big deal out of the idea of fit. And it's something, I worked with a student this past year who fell in love with a university in the UK that actually wasn't, it's prestigious in its field, but it's not
Hmm.
renowned outside of its field.
Hmm.
And, fell in love with it. And I finally just had to talk to the student's mom and be like, look, I know on paper that place looks great, but I also know certain things that your son holds near and dear. And someone of his background is not necessarily going to be happy there. The university in question had a reputation for being somewhere to the left of Berkeley.
Hmm.
And the student was decidedly more moderate. And, I'm
Yeah.
not saying that he shouldn't apply. I'm just saying that you need to have all the facts going in. But it is something that I think for some students, that prestige is part of the fit.
Yeah,
That,
there's no question about it. And there's some cultures and environments where there's tremendous pressure from peers or parents or both. And prestige actually, for a lot of people, equals respect. So if they
right.
don't have that, then they don't have respect, and everybody wants respect. And so it becomes very, very important just as a component of respect,
No,
and that's something you have to kind of read the room on and get a feel for the family. And then the other thing, I say all the time to my families, okay, if you walk into my restaurant and you're a vegetarian, it's not my job to sell you on a steak.
exactly.
So even if someone is emphasizing prestige more than I personally would, or I would advise my kids, like it's not really my job to get you to change your worldview on what matters to you. It's my job to find schools that align with what you're looking for.
Right. And there
Yeah.
is that added prism when going overseas of just because you haven't heard of it doesn't mean that it's not a huge deal. To kind of put it in American terms, I don't think the average 17 or 18-year-old who's interested in doing international relations has necessarily heard of the Fletcher School or SAIS at Johns Hopkins.
Sure.
But these are the places that, fast track yourself for a career at the State Department or one of those wonderful three-letter agencies or something like that. You know,
Okay, let me throw out another reason that I sometimes hear, which is I have family lineage in a country. Maybe grandma's over there, dad came from there. We go back there fairly often, and I've developed an affinity for the place or the language or the culture or the customs. And I like it when I'm there. I'm comfortable with it. And I kind of want to connect with my roots. Like when I look at students I've had that have come in with a strong bent toward international schools, a lot of times there's been some type of family connection there. Do you see a lot of that?
I absolutely do. Probably about a fifth of the students I work with have an overseas citizenship, and I think you're being very tactful to leave out what's often, at least for the parents, a very compelling factor of that, and that's outside of the UK and Ireland. If you have citizenship, you pay in-country tuition. So you've got a situation where, Mark, you know this as well as anyone, in Canada, those, even if they are in Canadian dollars, those overseas tuition rates are a little stout, but then you see the Canadian tuition rate, you're just like, that is lovely.
Yeah,
You start looking at places in the EU that I've got a student right now who's looking at universities in Sweden, happens to be an EU citizen. There are no university fees for EU citizens, not to go back on what I was saying about Germany and all of that
sure,
earlier.
sure.
But and it does become a thing of, you find where you're comfortable at.
So you think we've hit them all, the main one? So we've talked about political climate, we've talked about cost, we've talked about the ability to get into an elite, prestigious school in a way that's easier oftentimes to do over here, and we've talked about sort of connecting with family roots, family culture, citizenship. Any others?
I think the only other one, and it cracks me up how it comes up, is the idea that you're focused within your degree. And it's almost never, I'm just so interested in X subject that I want to
Sure,
spend the next 3 or 4 years doing it. It's almost always, I love the idea of not having to take another math or another English class.
sure. So, Kev, I think I unpack that because our listeners may not know how the overseas education tends to be very focused. Why don't you just explain that?
Right. So when you're going overseas, with some exceptions, it's a spectrum. At one end, closer to the United States, you have a lot of programs in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, and Scotland that do have maybe not the concept of a major where you're spending about a quarter to a third of your time and then electives and general ed requirements. They do have a breadth requirement at least that they want to see you explore outside of your very narrow specification or specialization. At the other end of the spectrum, we have programs that might be in, say, biology, in which you'll take the math classes as they apply to what you're learning in your biology classes, or you'll take the chemistry classes as they apply to what you're learning in your biology classes that are so specialized that you don't get a chance. We typically find those in continental Europe. And for a lot of students, the sweet spot tends to be something like the university colleges in the Netherlands or some of the more elective driven programs. I'm not talking the full liberal arts or natural sciences programs in the UK, but those that do have some flexibility or joint honors where you're spending the majority of your time. But if you randomly decide that you want to take a film class or environmental science class sometime, and you're flexible about when you can do it, that's an option.
Kev, this has been fantastic. Listeners, if you want more content like this, you can do a few things. You can subscribe, you can click the like button, and you can click that bell notification. And as soon as we drop a new video, you'll get it. Also, if you want to leave some in the comment section, we're launching this new YouTube channel after being your College Bound Kid podcast for 9 years. Early on, we're going to interact with those comments. And I don't know if we can promise that when they get really, really busy, but starting out, I'm going to be there in the comments fielding your questions. And Kevin's going to be doing some more of these. So we'll look forward to having you back, Kev. Thanks, my friend.
Always a pleasure, Mark.